Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Before School podcast. I'm your host Mark, and today we have an awesome guest, Matt Lohmeier. He was an F-15 pilot in the United States Air Force and a commander in America's new branch of the military, Space Force. He wrote a book in 2021 called Irresistible Revolution, which criticized Marxism in the military and some of the DEI policies. And for this writing, he was fired from his command and separated from the military. So we get into a lot of deep issues in our conversation about politics and culture and spirituality. But before we begin our conversation, I thought it would be best to add some context by playing a little clip for you guys. This is an interaction between Matt Lohmeier and President Trump, which happened about 2 months ago. Let's watch the clip.
Thank you, Mr. President. We now have time for one last question. So our last question...
Make this a good one.
Our last one comes from Matthew. Matthew? He was an F-15 pilot. I won't hold that against you.
Here, I got it. Mr. President, first off, I want to speak on behalf of everyone here and say thank you for taking time tonight to speak with our troops.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We got a lot of good-looking men in this audience, don't we, huh? And a lot of good-looking women also, by the way. Thank you very much. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to revisit something you've talked about already. My name is Matt Lohmeier. I was an Air Force F-15 pilot, and I was a commander in your newly created U.S. Space Force. I am also the first veteran of the Space Force because under the Biden-Harris regime, I was fired from my command and lost my pension for criticizing DEI trainings that were rampant in the military. Those trainings are still dividing our troops, and thank you for saying you would fire those few woke generals who are a big problem.
They're gone.
I'm going to suggest that it might, in fact, require ongoing oversight and a persistent, consistent, watchful eye within the Pentagon to ensure this monster never returns to the Defense Department. Will you consider establishing a special task force, office, or position to ensure that these monsters never return to the Defense Department?
You know what I'll do? And I'm pretty good at this stuff. Sometimes you get it wrong. I'm going to put you on that task force. I think it's good. Not going to do better than him. I'll put you on. Make sure you give the name. Thank you. Beautiful. Right? I have your approval.
Yes, sir.
I have your approval. We're not going to get better than him. You're right about it. You're right. 100%. Thank you.
Well, we desperately need people like you in Washington because it seems like all the sane people have left using their sanity.
Yeah.
And there's a great old quote. He who does not want power is fit to have it. I think that's from Plato. But it's so accurate, you know, like the people who really want power, you got to be a little skeptical, like, But you saying that you're hesitant to do so, I'm like, all right, come on, we need you.
Yeah, you know, in fact, many of the people I've rubbed shoulders with in Washington, D.C., even if they're likable, even if you share their political worldview, even if somehow culturally you're aligned with them, there is an odd bent spirit that many seem to possess where they're really excited to get into power and then to stay in that seat for the rest of their lives. And that's why some of these people end up being in Washington, D.C. for 30 or 40 years in the Senate or in the House. And once they're there, it's like they'll go to their grave working in those jobs before they relinquish power in the chief seats to anyone else from their state.
Yeah, it seems like the idea of a career politician is something new. Like before, you'd be a warrior and then you'd have to serve, or you'd be a carpenter or a blacksmith or something. You know, it was like your duty to serve politically for a little bit, but not make that your whole career, right?
Yeah, I think the best example we have of that in American history was in the first president, George Washington, who everyone is aware chose to step aside from the presidency after just 2 terms. And of course, we didn't make an amendment to our Constitution making that a law in the land until I think it was about World War II. Perhaps it was coincident with FDR's terms, multiple terms. And what was so admirable about George Washington's willingness to relinquish power was that at the time he became president of the United States, he had already rejected the demand for kingship, which is such a unique ability for a human to have come out of Britain. I mean, he's American, but the British system, where you have a sense for the power of a crown, and also disappointment with the improper or unjust ways in which the crown had acted, and to think that God has set me up to be the crown here in this new land, and I can do things better, and I can do things justly. And I think he was a virtuous and just and upright man. And instead, he wanted to establish a precedent that would be followed thereafter, and it was that while we have no king, we will have an extremely powerful executive branch that will be kept in check by other branches of the government. And he steps aside, and he wants, I think, my reading of Washington is that he wanted nothing more than to get back to Mount Vernon and to live the private life and to enjoy the things that were lovely and beautiful and noble in life, and to unseat himself from power and give some other poor chap the opportunity to suffer and to serve their fellow Americans. It's been flipped on its head today, unfortunately, and it's hard to find people who aren't ambitious for those seats.
Have you heard of the ancient Greek philosopher Polybius?
Yeah.
Polybius, yeah. He was a huge influence on the writers of the Constitution and the forefathers of America. And he had this idea of called anacyclosis, where every civilization goes through 6 phases and then repeats again. So it starts with a kingship, then it descends into tyranny, then a group of aristocrats rise up and throw out the dictator, and then they have an aristocracy for a bit, but then it devolves into an oligarchy where there's like a corrupt group of really rich people hoard all the wealth, and then there's a revolution, the people take over, then you have a democracy, and then that descends into anarchy eventually. And then it repeats.
And then people rise up and demand some heavy hand to come in and fix business.
Yeah, and so Polybius wrote about how the Romans figured out, because he was a Greek, and he watched the decline of the Greek Empire, and then he watched the Romans come in and take over Greece in a really short period of time. And he's like, I thought Greece was the best empire on the planet, and then the Romans come in and they just wipe us out. And so because he was so smart, the Romans took him as a hostage and basically made him like a royal advisor to the Scipios. And he got to see how the Romans did it, and they didn't have a monarchy or an oligarchy, they had a republic. And so they shared power among 3 branches that checked and balanced each other. And it sounds familiar because that's the biggest influence on how we started our nation, is we were like, all right, let's copy this Polybius model. So I think it's really great that the forefathers haven't had enough insight and respect for the past to kind of like integrate this.
Right. Yeah. I was reminded of another earlier Greek philosopher, Plato, who I don't remember if we'd mentioned Plato before we started recording, but in his Republic, which was essentially a treatise on justice. What is the just state? What is justice? What is a just human or a just individual? And as off-putting as some of the ideas he puts forth in the Republic are to either modern sensibilities or to a capitalist, liberty-loving, constitutional republic kind of a society or culture or system of government today, and it's often criticized and written off as a pro-utopian text, or maybe the first of those texts. It's an amazing work and a classic for a reason. And in Plato's Republic, Plato talks about the same kind of a shift between forms of government over time in the cycle of a rise and a fall of civilizations that you've just mentioned from Polybius. And one of the things that's always stood out to me as I watch our present juncture in human history, and in American history in particular, is that Plato suggests, and I suppose it's Socrates in the dialogue that suggests it, that there's at some point in that evolution the transition to democracy, and there is some great good that those in the democracy desire above all other things, and it's something like freedom or equality, but they desire it to excessive levels until things devolve into anarchy, and some serious contingent of people rise up and demand a heavy hand, and you end up with tyranny. And we've heard a lot of discussion during, it seems anymore now in the last several years, people forget we've got a constitutional republic as the ideal. That's the form of government we've got here. Everyone is talking about, on both sides of the political aisle, they're talking about our democracy, defending democracy. And while that's an ideal for the Western world, it's not what type of government we have. And in fact, it was a great fear of the founders of this country that we would overemphasize democracy because they were so familiar with the writings of Plato and these other early Greek and Roman philosophers' writings.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It seems like all civilizations kind of have this natural cycle where you start
Yes.
off with in a terrible situation like bondage, and then it takes great faith and courage to break out of that. And then you have a generation who works really hard and cares about education and has this mentality like they're poor, but they're building wealth. And then maybe a generation or two later, their kids grow up in a situation that's not so hard. And it's like that famous quote, strong men make soft times make soft men make hard times. It's like this cycle. So you come into a period of abundance. Those people don't know the struggle. They get entitled. They don't want to be responsible for anything. Then they kind of forego their responsibility and they become dependent upon a central power. And then you go back into bondage. It's like that cycle.
It is, and it's been characterized a number of different ways. One of the things I've read this past year that I thought was a really nicely done short book is called Immoderate Greatness, Why Civilizations Fail. It was written just over a decade ago, and it touches upon this idea of cycles. It pulls from a body of literature about these kinds of cycles, but it basically lists all of the ways in which flourishing civilizations end up destroying themselves. And it's really simply put, really well grounded, not too woo-woo and hard to believe. It's all very, very well done, and it's probably done in under 100 pages. And it was suggested by Ian McGilchrist, who's probably, I don't know if he's a psychologist, but he's written a couple of books about the left and right hemisphere theories of the brain. And most recently, he's written a 2-volume tome called The Matter with Things, which is marvelous. And it was in an interview that he had done with Jordan Peterson that he suggested people read Immoderate Greatness, Why Civilizations Fail. And because I like McGilchrist's work, I went and picked up that book and thought it was fantastic. And it's actually too sobering a read, because when you get done with it, you're all too discouraged about our prospects here in Western civilization. We've been around a long time. There are many people, and in fact they were writing at the beginning of the 20th century, who thought that Western civilization was already on its way out the door. We don't, in 2024, typically think of it that, well, we might be by now. But I'd say at the turn of this last century, from the 1990s to the 2000s, people are thinking, wow, we're at the height of civilization. And there are other outstanding historians and philosophers of history who were writing nearly 100 years ago that it looks like, based on these cycles, Western civilization has already kind of reached its peak. And then after the world wars, we've begun to see a kind of laziness and indolence and decline in morality and the virtues that characterize noble civilizations that allow them to be permanent. And as you witness that over the past 80 years, it's easier to see in retrospect than it was as it was unfolding, but people are really surprised today when they talk about wokeism or cultural Marxism, which we're going to talk about for a bit today, And they say, where did all this come from? How come it happened so fast? And the right answer is, well, that didn't happen all too fast, although its impact today, before your very eyes, seems all of a sudden, but it's been unfolding over a generation or two, unbeknownst to the average citizen who likes to get about their business and ignore all of that stuff. And when it's gotten so virulent, powerful, guttural, divisive as it is today, it's like a wrecking ball for civilizations. And that's why people are recognizing it in mass. They're very concerned about the trends that they're seeing, and they start shouting up and being bold and often being rude. It's like Nietzsche said, when you're fighting monsters, it's important to remember to not become a monster yourself. And that's a really difficult lesson, but it's all too easy to try and combat the chaotic forces all about us that seem to be threatening Western civilization each year, without turning into monsters that help further its collapse. But Immoderate Greatness is a really excellent read.
I'll have to check that out. So I have your book right here, Irresistible Revolution, and I love the title. And I'm curious to know, why is this gravitational pull towards Marxism so attractive? Why is it irresistible?
I stole the title, Irresistible Revolution, from one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, actually, who, as it turns out, was stealing this idea from yet another person. But one of the founders, who goes by Future Khan, said that the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. The role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. Well, what did she mean by that? They had to come up with branding, marketing, slogans that no decent person in their right mind would be willing to fight against. Hence, a title like Black Lives Matter. And you notice that when people had an emotional response to what Black Lives Matter stood for or was doing or was showing up in the news for supporting, they would try and counter the Black Lives Matter movement or its ideology with phrases like, well, all lives matter, at which point they're immediately criticized, ridiculed, and saying you're missing the point. You don't get it. You're not allowed to say something different or use a slogan that is at odds with something that we've established for the revolutionary purpose, which is that Black Lives Matter. And of course, no decent person would disagree with the idea that Black Lives Matter. That's why the slogan itself became irresistible. And for a season, not anymore, but for a season, you were considered indecent if you weren't somehow on board with both the organization and all of its aims. But in fact, they themselves, as an organization, were rapidly removing some of their aims from their own online platforms because they were so off-putting to American culture, traditional American culture. Western nuclear family, as they called it on their website, was a target and an aim of their revolutionary cause. They wanted to eliminate or eradicate the Western nuclear family. No one in America is really interested in buying into that, except for a very small minority of Americans. And so they were rapidly removing some of their slogans and policy aims, is what I should say, from their website. And Americans were trying to find a way that they could seem decent on the one hand, but still be fighting against the irresistible slogan of Black Lives Matter. Well, the pendulum has swung far enough in the opposite direction now, where people are so utterly fed up with lies, deceit, manipulation, and it's so abundantly clear in part because of platforms like social media, platforms such as X, where people are exposed to an abundance of information that maybe the mainstream media had never presented to them in their entire adult lives, and they're seeing clearly, at least they think they are, for the first time in their lives. And so now people are overly emboldened to fight against, speak up against some of these revolutionary causes or impulses. But that's where the title of the book comes from. And perhaps I should save this. No, I'll just keep going. Let me just keep going.
Yeah. This is great.
The book is about what people today are colloquially referring to as woke or wokeism. But what you'll notice is that I don't use that term in the book to describe cultural Marxism, and I'm deliberate in calling our present moment a consequence of Marxist thought. But the reason I didn't use the term woke in the text of the book when I wrote it at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021 is because that term wasn't even generally in use among the American people, if you can believe that today in 2024, 2020, I guess it's 2025 now. The term woke wasn't something I was familiar with while I was researching and writing the book. That's how rapidly the revolutionary impulse changes language, changes tradition, tries to abandon history and divorce a nation from its own history, its shared identity, and belief, underlying basic assumptions about reality and beliefs about the values that matter most to them. Revolutionary impulse changes all of that very quickly. Within a single generation, things can completely change 180 degrees out from the way that they'd ever been. I was deliberate in referring to all of this wokeism that threatens to undermine the national spirit as Marxism, because that's something that we ought to be familiar with, having lived through the 20th century, where Marxist revolutions disrupted the order of countries around the globe far more than we typically talk about. We usually talk about in America the Korean War, we talk about the Vietnam War, because we were major parties to those wars. People don't even recognize that what we were fighting there was the containment of communism and Marxist thought. On the one hand, in the early 1950s in the Korean War, you had a divided Korean peninsula, and if you look at a map, North Korea touches what was then the Soviet Union and Communist China. And the North Korean armies were supported by the communists, and the South Korean side of the border was supported by the Western world, which was anti-communist. And that's the whole reason we were there and involved in a conflict in Korea after World War II in the first place. The next decade, we're involved in the Vietnam War, and what do you have? You've got a divided Vietnam into a north part and a southern part, and the one is supported on the north by communists, and those in the south by the Western world, who is anti-communist. In addition to the Korean and Vietnam wars of the 20th century, there were dozens of other communist revolutions taking place in Central America, in South America, in Africa, in Asia, and all throughout Western and Eastern Europe, throughout the Mediterranean, that we never talk about. Some of them were short-lived and some of them are ongoing still today. And it should be something that, without any quibbling, Americans should be able to hear the word, recognize the ideology, and say, yeah, this is a terrible threat to all of the values we espouse as Americans. And yet, you see, now, in the 21st century, just a few short decades after the close of the Cold War, people are still fond of this idea. It doesn't die. The Marxist thought doesn't die, even if it wears different masks or goes by different names. And in that sense, I suppose Marxist thought is as old as recorded human history. What do I mean by that? The first story that shows up in the book of Genesis is about a family, and it's whether you consider it reality or a myth, the lessons there are appropriate to what we're talking about. You've got a fraternal dispute between Cain and Abel. And it appears, at least in part, to be a dispute about birthright. And there's sacrifice involved. And according to the story, God is pleased with one son's sacrifice and displeased with the others. And the accuser, the adversary, shows up whispering in one son's ear, "You've been dealt with unjustly. You're right. You're entitled to something that has been unjustly, unduly taken from you, and you can use violent force to take what rightly belongs to you." And so it begins with a brotherly conversation, at least that's how the story paints the picture. In a field, that then I imagine becomes angry, accusatory, and ultimately ends in violence and a fratricidal murder of a brother in the hopes of gaining something for himself that the accuser told him he had been unjustly stripped of. And that is the Marxist influence. It wasn't called Marxism back then because Karl Marx didn't write the Communist Manifesto until the mid-19th century. But that thread of victimhood and a victim ideology and accusations against the other, blaming the other for the problems we face in life, and then feeling at some point enough emotion and illogic and irrational. I'm going to restate all of that because it's becoming too muddled. I'll just say that at some point when you're taught to believe that you're the victim of injustice, there's enough of an emotional, guttural response to those ideas that you're willing to justify violent force as a means of reclaiming the thing that you're told belongs to you. There's a reason that some of the basic commandments that we've inherited in the Jewish and Christian tradition that show up in other traditions as well involve commandments like not envying others and their things or their wives or their property, not murdering, not bearing false witness against the other. All of the things that show up so early on in the Bible and in the formation of every civilization in human history are the very things we still struggle with today in 2025 as we watch the partisan, polarized debates that go on in Washington, D.C. We still have a problem with backbiting and envy and bearing false witness and accusation and with emotional response and anger. And it's at such a tipping point that it's possible that people are, and I think I see this already, willing to justify the use of violent force against the other in order to reclaim something that we've lost. That's a story as old as human history, and it took a very particular form with a very particular narrative in Western Europe, thanks to Marx and Engels in the mid-19th century, but it morphs and transforms with all of the same spirit that it's ever had, and it wears different masks and goes by different names that the perpetrators feel are best suited to the particular cultural context in which the revolutionary spirit needs to manifest. And in 21st century America, largely what has been used is the race discussion, because that works far better for the Marxist cause than economic divisions. And now, of course, we've roped in addition to the race division, other narratives of victimhood that relate to our ethnicity or our some tribal identity or our sexual preference or one of many genders. And there's always a bad guy and there's always a good guy that's determined for you in those narratives. And if you happen to fall into one group or the other, then you're entitled to certain things or you're entitled to have certain things taken from you. Sorry, that's pretty long-winded, but that's just me kind of rambling about some of how this is all connected throughout history, I guess.
Oh, no, that was brilliant. And you really helped me connect a lot of things by going all the way back to the beginning of human nature. And you made me think, is this just part of human nature? Because if we study history, we can see very clearly that this always leads to horror and tyranny and mass death.
Yes.
And yet there's always going to be people who feel like a victim, and they're always going to want to point a finger. It's just like it's the first story in the Bible. They're always going to want to point a finger because it's the easy thing to do. And no matter how you configure society, there's always going to be people who feel like they're unfairly on the bottom. And so, like when Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto, at the time it was a class struggle economically. You know, you had the workers
Yes.
versus the proletariat, and they felt exploited. Now, James Lindsay was talking about this. In today's world, you couldn't divide people up like that because workers are doing quite well. They're quite comfortable. They don't want to burn it all down because they have a TV and air conditioning and electricity and all that. But there are people now it's cultural Marxism, because you have,
Yes.
if you look at demographics, you could say, oh, wow, this race is doing a lot worse than this race. It must be an oppressor class. And then there's all this energy that you can harness, that people who want to push this agenda forward can kind of manipulate people and say, and help these kind of useful idiots to push this greater agenda forward. And I guess my question is this just part of human nature, or could we ever get off this Marxism train?
I will use simple Christian language from, I'll use simple Christian language that people might extract from the Bible to answer the question. And of course, in Western civilization, we have a Christian founding in America and Judeo-Christian roots and support throughout the Western world. But the enemy of men's souls knows how best to overturn order, to undermine agency, to sow division and chaos, and to cause men to be violent. It's been the same throughout human history. Human nature has not changed throughout all of recorded human history, and therefore the tactics that are employed by the adversary to upend order and instill chaos have always been the same. They have taken different names, however, and of course, each context is slightly different, and so there's an adaptation of tactics. But all humans are susceptible to these vices, and so part of the Christian heritage, if you believe in the heritage, is that we've got these governing commandments that show up early on, and of course additional teachings in the New Testament that teach you how to abandon those vices so as to enable the flourishing of the civil society. In fact, the Ten Commandments are like the minimalist prerequisite for a functional society. And anywhere that they are relatively honored or upheld, you have a flourishing society. Anywhere or anytime, anywhere on the earth where those things are not intact, and I'm talking about taking other people's spouses and killing each other and false accusations, those kinds of things break down a society faster than just about anything else, to say nothing of foreign adversaries. And so I came out of the military profession. I was in the Air Force and in the Space Force, and of course had to train how to defeat a foreign adversary if we were ever in a conflict with a foreign adversary. And yet I often wondered how it was we were going to escape our own slide back to Gomorrah. How is it that you avoid, as a civilization that abandons God, abandons a belief in even the necessity of keeping these Ten Commandments, how is it that you avoid succumbing to the fate of every other dead civilization throughout human history? And I don't think it's possible. That's one of the themes in that book I mentioned earlier, Immoderate Greatness. At some point, you have to adopt, believe in, and act upon the principles that allow society to be preserved. And when you abandon them, death is just one generation away. And we're at the verge. Unfortunately, there's lots of decent people who believe in these things and try and uphold them. But there are plenty of people who are actively attacking those. Listen to this statistic. I mean, it's tangential. It's not directly related. Oh, that's a text thread with you. I'm looking for a different one here. A friend just sent me this statistic. Totaling all deaths in the world right now, totaling all deaths in the world from causes other than abortion, not just American civilization, I'm talking the entire world. Totaling all the deaths in the world from causes other than abortion reveals a figure of 62.5 million, meaning that abortions accounted for just over 42% of all human deaths in the year 2024. Globally, there were more deaths from abortion in 2024 than all deaths from cancer, malaria, HIV, AIDS, smoking, alcohol, and traffic accidents combined, according to Worldometer statistics. You think about that kind of a statistic, and it tells you something about the cultural shift, the value shift of. Now, I would expect something different from Western civilization, or frankly, you'd expect something different from any of the major faith centers of the world that seem to share this in common, this appreciation for the sanctity of human life. But this is a global statistic, and it doesn't matter if you're talking Christian countries. This is the big killer, and yet oftentimes when you see statistics of what is killing off civilizations, everything else is listed, but not this. It's like that's not one of the causes of death that's included in the statistic roll-up. It's like, here's the top 10 reasons. You see things like car crashes, and you see smoking and alcohol, and you see murders, violent crime, and so forth, but you don't see the abortion rate, which is the top killer. So it's related to what we're talking about.
Oh yeah, it's all related. And I've been focused on this birth rate plummeting issue quite a bit, and our impending population decline, because we're probably living right now in the time where there's going to be the most humans on the planet ever in history. And very soon you have like a very giant bubble in the global population of older people. And once, the baby boomers really start to die off, the population is going to fall off a cliff. And it's already happening in places like Korea and Japan, where they're just not replacing their numbers. And there's not a workforce to support the older population. And those statistics that you just shared were really sobering and shocking, because I know a lot of good people who are trying very hard to have kids, and they're not able to.
My wife and I are among them.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
Don't include that, but yeah, we've got 2 kids. We've wanted more, but we've not been successful.
Yeah, I hear the story. I just had my first daughter a few weeks ago, and I'm super grateful. But it's crazy how often you talk to other couples and they tell you how difficult it is. And then to think that on the other side, we're eliminating so much human life through abortion. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I think the whole term of pro-choice is a psyop term, because if you have choices, you're not going to get an abortion. If you have a loving relationship, good finances, a good home, if you're in the ideal situation, you will not resort to abortion. So calling it pro-choice, to me, that's what you do when you don't have choices. You get,
Interesting.
So I think that whole term,
it's the great sin of our day, it seems. Of course, there's no shortage of sin, but it's a big problem. And it reminds me of a passage from the book of Enoch. It's in what chapter is it in? I can't remember. But it mentions, of course, the Watchers. It mentions the fallen angels. And one of them, the 5th named angel, is the one that brings knowledge of the smitings of the embryo in the womb to the children of men, that they then employ to great gain and benefit to themselves, because it allows them the abrogation of responsibility, the responsibility of child rearing, that is, and allows them promiscuity without incurring the responsibility. And in fact, that in essence is a diminishing of agency or free will. It's like you can choose this thing, but you won't be accountable to the same degree that you would have been if you had allowed a child into the world. We'll allow you to choose sin, and you can delay the consequences of that decision. Again, I mean, it's brilliant tactic that can be used to destroy civilizations. Maximize pleasure, reduce or limit responsibility, and the number of children. And it's a big problem.
Yeah, I'm about to start working on a video with Dr. Sarah Hill, and she writes about the consequences of birth control that we don't talk about, and how much they alter your brain, and how some of these changes are permanent. We're going to be recording this video tomorrow, but it's crazy how much it can change your preferences on who you're attracted to. Birth control makes women attracted to men with much lower testosterone, because it kind of tricks the brain into thinking that you're pregnant. And when you're pregnant, you want a guy who's very like kind of agreeable and submissive. You don't want some like wolf man around. Right. It's too dangerous. So the preferences of what you're attracted to are very different. And so I don't know a ton about this research, but I'm excited to learn more about like the many, like I like to look at everything on like a spiritual level, a psychological level, biology, physical, like on as many levels. So this whole like population impending doom type of thing, civilizational cycles, there's so many ways you can look at it, from like a spiritual biblical way. You can look at it from like a biology way. Like our biology is almost kicking our species off the planet. They're saying, you guys aren't living right. And I don't know.
Yeah, we've got serious consequences we're staring at if we continue to pursue some of our present path.
But we've gone down a good thread here, but I should have,
Yeah, I wasn't
I'd love to
expecting
start-
any of this.
this has been great. I'd love to kind of get like your explanation of what Space Force does and what your role was there.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I will say what my role was first. I was a commander of a space-based missile warning unit in the Space Force. I was in command from 2020 to 2021. The Space Force as an entity, as a new branch of the military, was created in December of 2019. It was announced by President Trump the year before in 2018. And the president had the prerogative to direct the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Air Force, who was directly involved in the creation of a new branch because it was to fall to her at the time, to be responsible for that newest branch of the military. But the president surprised all of these people in 2018 by announcing that he thought it was a good idea to create an independent branch of the military for space. And up until that time, the Air Force, throughout the entire Cold War, had been the branch of the military that was responsible for all of our national security space capabilities and objectives. And there were reasons why certain members of Congress on both sides of the political aisle were interested in the idea of an independent branch of the military for space. Some of those reasons they thought were good reasons for a new branch were cultural. Some of those reasons were budgetary. And those ideas gained momentum and were presented to President Trump and Vice President Pence, who happened to be a space junkie. He's a bit of a space nerd. And you had the right administration in place to receive the idea of directing a stand-up of a new branch of the military. But the executive branch is not authorized to create a new branch of the military. So when you hear people refer to the Space Force as Trump's Space Force, or at least they used to, that was done derisively, in jest, as if to suggest that it's a stupid idea. But in fact, the idea preceded the Trump-Pence administration by a number of years. In fact, as much as 2 decades before the Trump-Pence administration, people had been thinking about the idea of creating an independent branch of the military for space, whether it was called the Space Corps, like the Marine Corps is, or the Space Force. The idea was that you'd have a branch of the military that was able to forge its own culture, have its own budget, and have a 4-star general or admiral that would sit at the table with the other Joint Chiefs and make important decisions about how to train and equip space warfighters. Well, Trump announced in 2018 that you'd have a new branch of the military, and then it was left to these members of the Defense Department to work with members of Congress in the legislative branch to make that happen. And in fact, it was in December of 2019 that did happen. It was written into U.S. Code Title 10 and became the 6th branch of the military. It was the first time we had created a new branch of the military since 1947, when the Air Force had been created. We placed a 4-star general, same rank system as existed in the Air Force. We placed a 4-star general in charge of the Space Force and called that person the Chief of Space Operations. That person then took a seat at the Joint Chiefs table and had an equal voice, theoretically, in decisions that were being made by all branches of the military about budget and capabilities-related decisions. Generally speaking, the Space Force does, in and through the space domain, what the other branches of the military do in their own respective domains. The Army is responsible, of course, not for the sea and not for the air, but for the land domain, even if it does have capabilities that reach out to and touch those other domains. The Navy, of course, and the Marines are responsible for the watery domain, the sea domain. And the Air Force is responsible for the air domain. And the age that we live in seemed ripe for a serious conversation about whether or not we should treat the space domain, which is, of course, far more vast, expansive, larger than any of the other domains, as its own domain. And there began to be a consensus that we should treat it as its own domain. And our adversary competitors on the world stage, such as China in particular, and Russia, and other spacefaring nations, had already begun treating space as if it was its own distinct, separate domain. And we already had a space infrastructure, commercial, private, and otherwise, in place. And so there were serious conversations to be had about how you protect those capabilities that belong to different countries, and how you enable other capabilities in the other domains. And one of the ways we had been doing that for some time was through space. And so after Congress approved the creation of a Space Force, then you had a bunch of the existing units that did space-related activities in the Air Force transfer over into, I mean, they stayed at the same base, they had the same operators, transfer into the new branch of the military. They relabeled themselves Space Force. They changed their uniforms. They began to establish their own unique culture. And they began to be, rather than previously being just air-minded warriors, they began to be more space-minded warriors, where they didn't think about things in terms of the land, sea, or the air. They thought about things in a mindset and from a certain vantage that your typical American or even your typical warfighter isn't capable of thinking through. It's very difficult. When I became a fighter pilot, I learned it's very difficult to leave the boots on the ground perspective of the everyday man and to sit in a cockpit and start visualizing things in a three-dimensional, fast-paced, dynamic environment of the fighter domain. It's very different. It's a transition to an altogether different mindset. And I was surprised further to see that it was more difficult to make the leap when I went from being an Air Force fighter pilot to the Space Force. It was more difficult to make the transition from being air-minded to thinking through things in terms of orbital mechanics and learning an entirely new grammar or vocabulary of a domain that is uncommon, and to then learn of ways in which our adversaries are actually exploiting that space that doesn't enter into normal humans' minds. One of the things that our adversaries are doing, China in particular, are developing space-based solar power. We fancy the idea of solar power on the ground and electric vehicles, but there's an entire space-based solar architecture that is beginning to get underway, and the United States is behind the power curve in that regard compared to our competitors such as China, and any number of other applications. So that's generally speaking what the Space Force is and does. And it seeks to deter conflict in and from the space domain, like all of our other branches of the military do in their own domains, and then be prepared to wage and win conflict in and from that domain if we happen to end up in a war. There are specific missions that the Air Force used to do that now belong to the Space Force. Very quickly, I'll just share a few of them. Space-based missile warning is one of those capabilities. We've got infrared sensors up in geosynchronous orbit, about 22,000 miles above the Earth, and we are constantly watching the Earth for heat signatures. I'll say that again. We are constantly watching the Earth for heat signatures of missile or rocket launches against a relatively cool backdrop of the Earth. And we pick up phones and report on what we're seeing and give our own troops and our allies a heads up that they need to duck and cover because there's about to be a rocket that'll land on their building in 3 minutes. And that's one of the missions that we do in the Space Force. We've got a position, navigation, and timing mission, otherwise known as GPS, that used to be done by the Air Force that's now exclusively done by the Space Force. We've got strategic communications that are done in the space domain. We've got intelligence gathering operations that are done in the space domain. And we've got warfighting capabilities that maybe your sci-fi reader might be able to imagine that have been worked on for a very long time in the space domain, and our adversaries are working on in the space domain. And it's not difficult to disrupt or degrade or destroy a satellite in space. Sometimes it's as simple as obscuring its field of view. In another instance, it might be grabbing it and shaking it. But when you begin talking about blowing something up in space, which is something we used to do back during the Cold War, but don't do very often anymore, then you start to run into all sorts of terrible downstream consequences of blowing something up in space, like thousands of pieces of debris that are now in orbit in uncontrollable patterns that might jeopardize the entire on-orbit space architecture of every nation, debris fields that are uncontrollable. And so those are things that every responsible spacefaring nation is having to take into account as they consider how it is that they deploy capabilities in that domain and how it is that they become responsible actors in the space domain. And the last thing I'll say about this, is that all other warfighting domains, from the Army and their tanks and soldiers and boots on the ground kind of folks, to our sailors and Marines in the Navy and their ships, and our fighters and our tankers and our bombers and our airmen in the Air Force, all of it is, to some degree, and today it's to a large degree, enabled by and made capable by reliance upon the capabilities that we have up in orbit in the space domain. And if you lose the ability to successfully manage that space domain and to keep healthy those capabilities that are there, then it's likely that you lose your ability in just about every other domain. So it's a really big enabler, a force enabler and force multiplier. It's also a point of incredible vulnerability, not just for our nation, but for other nations. One of the things we do poorly, I said I was going to be saying just one last thing, but I was wrong. This is the last thing I'll say about the Space Force thing. One of the things that we do a poor job talking about culturally in this newest branch of the military and the Space Force is the non-man-made threats that come from the solar environment and from the space environment that might entirely upend our man-made space-based architecture. Are we going to cross paths with pieces of a comet like we have so many times throughout Earth's long history? Are we going to be hit by asteroids? Are we going to be burned up by giant solar flares, as we know is possible? How will the weakening of the magnetosphere impact our space capabilities a decade from now, and magnetic changes and reversals here on the Earth? All of those things are so far removed from the overwhelming majority of our Space Force operators that it's actually a bit troubling. And I know that it's also absent from the day in, day out thoughts of our senior Pentagon officials who run the Space Force, because there are other alligators nearer the boat, is how they'd put it, things like China. And so we're so busy combating one another here on the Earth, as I imagine it's always been throughout human history, that when the surprises come from up above in the heavens, it disrupts all of our plans. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang aft to glay, and lay us not but grief and pain for promised joy, is how it's put. And I suspect that as technologically advanced as we are in every domain, including the space domain, we could wake up any day of the week and be wholly unprepared to successfully negotiate a cosmic kind of an event that I've just mentioned.
That was well put. And this is how you and I met, through our interest in these cosmic cycles and ancient past. And it's through Randall Carlson. It's amazing how often we get hit by things in space and we don't think about it. But like, are we doing anything to protect ourselves from an impact?
We have some integration in the Space Force with NASA, who has its own Office of Planetary Defense. It's a minimal level of integration and cooperation there. I'm hopeful that in the incoming administration we'll resurrect the National Space Council that has been all but abandoned during the past 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration, and that the new NASA administrator will work hand in hand with the leadership in the Space Force and the Secretary of the Air Force to forge a better path to planetary defense than we have so far. I know that I know from experience that it's difficult to think of anything but conflict with a great power. And that is how our national security strategy is written. That's how our national defense strategy is written. But all humans, and this is the globalist side of me talking, and I say that tongue in cheek, but all nations genuinely should be concerned about the cosmic impact on our way of life in whatever country we happen to live in our modern civilized, relatively civilized lives. If we have the kind of cosmic impacts that we know occasionally come here, it seems like on cycles to the Earth, every one of our modern great power competitors is going to be sent back to the Stone Ages, while those who live a relatively modest Stone Age-like lifestyle are going to be the ones most likely to see it through the next transition period. And that's not something that that the holders of the chief seats who wage statecraft for business often have on their mind, despite what online conspiracy theorists might like to have you believe. They're always pointing out the bunkers that are being built, and they're pointing out that these guys really know what's coming. They're aware of these cycles, and I don't believe that in most cases. I think they are self-interested, that's for sure. And they might think that there's great power outages coming or nuclear war that's coming, that's for sure, even if they can't predict or control how and when those things come. But I think they think very little of the heavens and the long history of the earth and these recurring cycles of destruction. In fact, it's in Plato's Timaeus. The opening pages of Plato's Timaeus is, incidentally, Critias talking in this particular part of the dialogue. And he's recounting what Solon brought back by way of knowledge from the Egyptian priests. And Critias says that in Egypt they had the view that occasionally, like clockwork, the earth was destroyed in great cataclysm by the mediums of fire and water. But then it says something else we don't typically focus on, and by various other means on a much smaller scale, often, basically, and that's my words. And I think that's right. There's a reason we know so little about the past. There's a reason. I'll put it this way: all things happen in cycles, at the microcosmic level and at the macrocosmic level. All things happen in cycles. There is a birth and a death to all things, and that includes people, and it includes families, it includes kingdoms and civilizations, and it includes worlds. And in that way of speaking, I mean functional, a functional phase or age of the world in which people are living and flourishing, in which they're destroyed and have to be regrown and reborn or replenished.
Yes. Well, modern humans have been around for at least 200,000 years. Yet we only have about, at most, 6,000 years of recorded history. So one thing I love about Randall's work is what happened for those at least 195,000 years. Mm-hmm. We don't have anything. And then he goes through the geology, and he shows that at least 16 times there have been events that would wipe out every major city on Earth. And then it makes sense why we don't have any historical record, really, of humans beyond 6,000 years. Because, mm-hmm. if an asteroid hit our Earth right now that was that size, that could wipe out every city on Earth, everything on the internet would be gone. Every hard drive, server, everything on that would not exist. The only things that would survive would be like Mount Rushmore and the pyramids.
Yeah, until they're broken up by fire or some other medium and completely turn into a bunch of gravel.
And then, yeah, like you said, it'd be those uncontacted tribes living completely off grid out in the middle of nowhere that would go on living. It would be like just another day for them. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't be affected.
Yeah, this is a fascinating subject. It doesn't matter what religious tradition or myth one prefers. The thread is the same. even if the actors' names are different, the gods or god names are different, the heroic figures are different, the themes are the same. And this theme of cycles, of birth and a planting of civilization, of a first man and a first woman, of destructive cycles, great floods or great burnings, and of an end coming. All of those themes appear in the great religious traditions and the mythical traditions. And whatever literal, historical aspects there are to any of those myths or religious traditions, certainly the themes are worth paying attention to. And it seems to, I mean, even the library at Alexandria, as vast as it was and as protected as it was, it's all gone. And there hasn't been a great flood since then, and there hasn't been a great consuming fire of the earth since then. That was one of those lesser destructions. That's just the course of civilizations and time and conquest and competing tribes and a little fire. And I mean, it's amazing what can be undone and erased from history in minor ways, to say nothing of these great cataclysms. And I suspect that there are entire worlds buried under the ice on this planet, and that come some future cycle, a lot of what today looks like flourishing tropical, lush society with infrastructure and technology will be buried under ice or a mountain or a lake or an ocean. That's just the way it goes.
Now we're getting out there. Do you think there's any bases out there on other planets, or any anomalies, anything that we'd be surprised by?
Well, I'd say it depends on what you mean by it. I have a particular worldview. Let me say it this way, and we can weave in the UFO discussion in this part of the conversation, because there is a natural desire that humans have to believe that we're not alone in the cosmos. At least I think most normal people are excited at the fact that there might be intelligent life elsewhere. Some of the UFO sightings that we have record of, I've often poo-pooed that in my adult life, and having been in the military, I say, well, I chalk that up to government work. Much of what people are seeing is likely government programs, acknowledged or unacknowledged, or tricks of cameras. But I was watching a documentary that was done in 2020 called Phenomenon. I was watching it with my wife late at night, and it was probably 45 or 60 minutes into this documentary. We had air traffic controllers talking about a phenomenon that they occasionally see at their airfields. It's not common, it's rather rare, of these balls of light that seem to zip around the flight lines and be able to defy the known laws of physics incredibly fast. And they were like big orbs of light, orange or yellowish in color. And I paused the film, and I remembered, as odd as that sounds, that I'd seen the exact same thing in high school when I was in the mountains in Arizona. And I told my wife, I said, I've seen this. I know exactly what they're talking about. And she said, no, you haven't. I said, no, I really have. And she says, we've been married for 10 years. You've never mentioned this once. And it's true. I hadn't mentioned it because it was one of those things I'd never understood. It was a very peculiar experience. I was with another girl at the time when I saw this. And so I said, look, come with me. We're going to go to Facebook. We're going to go online, and we're going to send a message to this girl I've not reached out to in 20 years. And I'm going to say, hey, remember me? Remember that time we were in the Tucson Mountains, which is exactly what I did. I said, do you remember that thing we saw? And I didn't say anything else. And she responded back immediately. And I was like, hey, be careful. My wife's here with me. I don't want you to embarrass me. And she said, yeah, that big freaking ball of light UFO thing that we saw. And my wife was surprised that, in fact, it was just as that documentary Phenomenon had depicted it. And what I shared with my wife thereafter, and had always been puzzled about, was that this ball of light that we saw descending down over our head got close enough for me to look at it and into it, and it seemed to be buzzing with life, but it wasn't man-made. It was very well organized, very spherical, and it seemed to be very conscious of the two of us that were sitting there in the Arizona mountains, like it was observing us. And it was a distinct impression that I had that I was being watched, observed, that there was a level of interest from the orb to us, and it frightened us. And so we got up and we ran to the car and we ran away, and that thing zipped up and disappeared in the sky. It was dark, it was nighttime. And it wasn't until this past year, 2024, I'm reading a new book that's come out by Robert Temple called A New Science of Heaven about plasma cosmology, plasma physics, plasmoids. And in chapter 5 of that book, there's a whole discussion about ball lightning. Someone before had asked me, do you think you saw ball lightning? I said, no, I think I know what that is. I didn't see ball lightning. Well, there's a thorough explanation of ball lightning and the 4 chapters previous to that is all about plasma, plasma physics, and plasma in the universe, and the Kordylewski clouds that exist between the moon and the earth, which most people haven't heard of. And the description of these balls of light that have been observed by thousands of people, rare as they are, in chapter 5 of A New Science of Heaven was so striking to me that I am now absolutely confident that what I saw in the Tucson mountains back when I was in high school was exactly what Robert Temple describes in chapter 5 of that book. You can call it ball lightning, you can call it a plasmoid, but many people who have observed this phenomenon describe it as them having a distinct impression that they were being observed or watched by this entity, this ball, and that it seemed to defy the laws of physics as we understand them. It can move against the wind with relative ease. It can go through solid walls and objects without any disturbance. These balls sometimes show up in rooms. They have shown up in commercial airliners or in passenger cars, and they seem to roll or float down the aisle and look at people and observe what they're doing and thinking, and then just dart back through the wall and go on off. And it's something that's reminiscent of, and this is now me getting back to your question about bases on other planets and things. It seems to be reminiscent of what it seems a spirit body, and I'm talking beings, or resurrected body of the Lord, for example, is described as being capable of doing in the New Testament or in the Old Testament. We have an account in the New Testament where a recently resurrected Lord, who's apparently taken up his body, or a body, appears in a locked room to show himself to his disciples. Well, that's impossible. It is, according to our modern laws of physics, but it's not impossible for a plasma body. It's not impossible for an exceptionally refined matter that we would call spirit, or that we would call immaterial, even if it's not immaterial. And we've got accounts of angels coming into rooms and visiting people. We've tended in the modern materialist secular mode that we've been in for some time to just outright dismiss these things, or they've somehow become taboo. But now even scientists are willing to begin to investigate the possibility that there are actually legitimate scientific explanations for how, in fact, that might be possible for beings to exist, whether we see them or not with the eyes at all times, in the invisible realm. If you take a look at the Earth or the sun or any number of things that exist in space, using a different lens, not the optical lens, but ultraviolet or infrared, what you'll see is something that looks like a sea creature flapping its wings and swimming through the great deep. The Earth is rolling forward on its wings, and there are connections of streams of light between the sun and all of the planets in our solar system. And all of the stars are connected by these gossamer threads of light called Birkeland currents. And all of that is plasma. And it's only been in the past couple of decades that we've been able to actually directly observe these things that has gotten even the astronomers scratching their heads and saying, you know, maybe there's more to this cosmos than we've ever before been able to acknowledge. And we ought to start looking into some of these things. And maybe that explains how it is that electricity and magnetism seem to be everywhere in the cosmos, even though in this, what we used to call the vacuum of space, it seems to our optical lens as if it's empty. In fact, it's filled with plasma, and plasma is highly conductive. And so there's this energy that's instant and direct and immediate between all of the stars that seems to connect all of us. It seems to be responsible in part for even our gravity, which until now, until recently, we've chalked up just to density and mass of an object and distance of an object. But you go back to some of the earlier astronomers, to Newton, and then I really like Johannes Kepler and the Copernican age, and they were talking about things that were dismissed in the Age of Enlightenment, whatever that might mean now. They were dismissed as kooky, as being far too religious, far too spiritual, far too occultic for our modern sensibilities. And so we've written them off, especially Kepler. But only recently his writings have been now translated into English. And you go look at what people like these great minds like Kepler were thinking about. Their whole mentality is absorbed in their Bibles, in occult literature, in astrology, and why I mention all of that is just to say this: they genuinely believed that everything in the cosmos was connected, and it led to stunning revelations that we now just consider materialist, secular, wholly unconnected, disconnected, and that humans are some great accident. Now, I happen to believe that there's plenty of life out there, whether we can see it with our natural, mortal, fallen eyes or not. And in fact, angels do visit men and women on the earth. Beings exist. And in most cases, when they interact with humans on the earth, they don't come in spacecraft. They can just appear. They don't need a spacecraft to get here. It's possible that, in fact, there are others like us that might be reliant on a spaceship to make those journeys. I'm not aware of any viable instance in which we've had an extraterrestrial visitor who breathes like us and who shows up in a spacecraft. I've read some stories. I don't find them very credible. But I do believe in many of the eyewitness accounts of extraterrestrial, angelic, or demonic visitors who have shown up, interacted with men and women, and in fact have had my own experience, unfortunately with the demonic side and not with the heavenly angelic side, but that was in 2003 in December. And so, these things are realities that most humans the world over believe in. And now we've finally got some science that's willing to look into it and abandon a centuries-long orthodoxy that they've been all too reluctant to abandon. I'm giving really long answers to the questions that you're teeing up.
Oh, I love it because I'm not a big talker. So I'm just like, I'm thrilled to just sit back and listen. And everything you're saying is really refreshing, actually. Because,
oh, good.
When I look at you, I think you're this big military, strong like figure. And my idea of military guys is like straight edge, kind of like all logic, no woo woo. Yeah. I could imagine trying to talk about angels and spirituality to like some guy at boot camp, and he would just like scream in my face and tell me to do push-ups. And so it's like really refreshing to hear you be so open about just to everything, to the ancient past, to the spirituality, to religion. Like it's just very refreshing. Because is this true? Is it in the military? Is it kind of looked down upon to like speak your mind, speak freely?
To an extent, it's true that culturally in the military we become reluctant to speak entirely freely. You don't lose your First Amendment rights when you join the military, but you are governed by the Uniform Code of Military Justice. There are certain things that are simply taboo. They're simply illegal for you to address. You can't be politically partisan in uniform while you're in an official capacity. You can go to a political rally in support of a Democrat or Republican or other candidate, but you can't do it in uniform. You can go vote and have your own political worldview, but if you show up in the military workplace in uniform in an official setting and start to say why if you're a Democrat you're a demon and if you're a Republican you're a Nazi, those kinds of things are expressly forbidden in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and they're punishable by court-martial. You can be separated from the service for doing some of those things. You can't publicly criticize your commander-in-chief, the president. You can't publicly criticize your chain of command, but you are welcome to share your worldview. I was in a military strategy class, since we're talking about religious things, spiritual things. It was 2019, I think, and Christianity came up. I'm kind of an odd blend of Christian and some other things, but I am Christian and I believe in Christ.
Me too.
But yeah, the topic of end times, last days came up, and I was in a room with 13 other Air Force career officers, very impressive people, and I asked the question, all right, I made the assertion that I thought it was entirely likely that Christ was going to return to the earth for the second coming during our lifetime. And you would have thought I'd grown an extra head, the look on other people's faces. And I asked the question, I said, does no one else in here? I said, are there other Christians in here? And like half of the group raised their hand. They said they were Christian. And I said, does any of you believe that it's possible that there's a second coming that's going to happen? And one person, after 2 or 3 seconds, one girl said, I think it's possible. That was the only person. And now everyone's entitled to their own view. I bring that up for 2 points. One, there are things that are somewhat, if not legally, but culturally off limits in the military. That's like an uncomfortable realm to get into with people in the military, even if they're Christian. It was like, yeah, we don't talk about that. I'll go to church on Sunday. You go to whatever church you do, but don't talk about that in here. We're here to talk about killing people, and to her credit, this girl that said, I think it's possible, and I think she really meant that, she's one of the fastest promoting officers in our Space Force right now. She's outstanding. She's a good person. But I have a very unique Christian worldview I came out of Mormonism for some time. I'm not a member of the Mormon faith. I should say I'm not a member of the Mormon church. But was a convert to Mormonism in high school. I'm very grateful for that tradition. It taught me a lot of good. And there's a lot of great things as a part of that tradition. I'm very Christian, but I'm all too Mormon for many Christians. I'm very Mormon, but all too Christian for some of my Mormon friends and family. I'm all too occultic and esoteric for many of the hardcore, straight-shooting Bible Christians. I'm very much into the occult, esotericism, Gnosticism, if there's anything true or lovely in any of these traditions, I want it to be a part of my worldview. And of course, there's plenty of darkness in a lot of these traditions as well, and that includes Christianity, Mormonism, and all of the above. But there's a movement I'm not a part of, nor do I want to be, but it's called Theosophy, a Theosophical Society. And Manly P. Hall, for example, Madame Blavatsky, other famous writers were a part of the Theosophical Society and Theosophical tradition. And they have a motto that I very much like, and it's that basically all truth is our religion. Truth is our religion. And that resonates with me. I still believe Christ is my Lord, and yet there is so much truth that exists for us in the religious texts, myths of the world, and the sciences. There is a way to piece together truth, and it's partly by study and it's partly by faith, the latter of the two being the hardest. And I think that this is a topic you didn't ask to get into, so I'll cut things off here. But more and more, as the world descends into a kind of chaos and abandons morality and is unhinged from traditional values in some ways, and becomes rather chaotic, radical egalitarian, radical libertarian, radical, pick your thing. It's also opened a way for people to be all the more interested in genuine, authentic other humans who have a unique vantage or worldview. And they're like, hey, no judgment here. I'm really interested in who you are and what you've got going on. And like, I get it. We all come from different backgrounds, but if you've got something that's of value to me, I'm interested in learning from you. I think that's a healthy aspect to all of the chaos that we see at the moment. It's like hippie revolution 2.0, but it doesn't need to involve drugs and sex ad infinitum. It's like, hey, I can keep my values intact and appreciate and respect you, and you might have an entirely different path, but if we can find something of which we can be of mutual benefit to one another, then let's share with each other and love one another for that. And more I'm seeing in the military, as well as since separating from the military, I find there are a great number of people out there who are just genuinely interested in the truth, come from whence it may, and that's a good thing. And I think it's a part of the transition, in fact, to a new age. That's something we won't have time to get into today, but that's related to the stars and where we are in these cycles that I think I have a bit of insight about that I don't get to talk about publicly, but we've entered a new age, and that will come with its consequences and opposition. Some of it's very dark, and some of it's very light-filled. And people have decisions to make about what path they're going to pursue and what camp they're going to sit in. And I'm not talking politically. I'm not talking just, are you a Christian? Or do you believe in your Bible or not? Or have you professed with your lips or not? I'm not talking about any of that. But it's like, are you genuinely choosing to align your soul and your consciousness with truth and beauty and goodness, or are you going to fight against it and your fellow man? Because I think both will manifest here in the years ahead, and it'll bring about. That's why it's called in Christian scripture the great and dreadful day of the Lord. It's going to be both for different people.
Yeah, you're making me think of Hermetic principles about how the pendulum swings one way and then there's an equal and opposite reaction. And it seems like culturally we went to a very chaotic place, and spiritually as well. And
yes,
Nietzsche talked about this, God is dead, and how everybody's going to fracture off and go to become their own God. In some ways that's good, but in a lot of ways, can you even have a country without a common belief system? Can people even function with one another if they don't have some fabric of common values? Like, can we agree on that we don't want to kill each other? Well, if we can't agree on that, then we're just going to devolve into complete madness. And I think you can see in certain areas, people can't agree on the most basic core values. And Nietzsche had a quote. He said, for angels, no law is necessary. And for devils, no law is enough. And so you see some certain places that are very godless and have turned to nihilism. They have so many laws and regulations, but it's never enough. They can put all their products behind plexiglass. They can, tax at the highest rate, but it's not going to fix the problem. It's a spiritual problem, Yeah,
let me go back to something that you said, and it was maybe a rhetorical question, but can we have a country without a common set of beliefs? You can also ask, can you have a nation without a common set of beliefs? And I want to make a distinction. They're two different things. When you think of a nation, you think of a group of people who have a shared historical or ethnic, cultural, linguistic backdrop, and they have a shared sense of identity, and they may or may not have geographically specific political boundaries or a territorial integrity. I think of the Kurds as an example of a nation that transcends geopolitical borders. They're across Syria and Turkey and Iraq and and Iran and probably any number of other countries. And they're a large nation of people who share all of those cultural necessities that I would tie to nationhood, but they don't have their own country. Now, the reverse of that was I'm going to talk about the United States. We have a country called the United States. It's, in theory, still got political sovereignty. It's all but abandoned its territorial integrity, which sovereign states, and by states I mean countries, are extremely reluctant to do normally. But that country was founded by a nation of people of European descent. They were largely America isn't a white or black thing, but there was a white European nationhood that existed at the founding of our country. And of course, it became very quickly a place that welcomed immigration, as long as people were willing to assimilate into the national values of America. And it didn't matter if you were black. It didn't matter if you were from India or Afghanistan or from China. But people came here because they believed in the greatness of the American ideal, of the idea that we can, through our effort and merit, acquire property and value in the society and can benefit one another. And we have this freedom to worship God according to the dictates of our own conscience. It happened to be a Christian nation. But with the passage of time and the overabundance of immigration, which included different cultures, which included different languages, which includes different religious belief systems, and therefore different value systems, not all of which are created equal. Not all cultures are created equal. We have a country, in a political sense, that is made up of multiple nations. We've tried for some time to pretend, and some of these ways of putting things might have been frowned upon for a number of years here, but we need to get down to reality and speak the truth. We've pretended like all value systems are created equal or should be valued equally. We've pretended like all cultures are created equal, but they're not. And in fact, and we've called this multiculturalism, and there's a myth of multiculturalism as if it makes for a stronger, better country. But there is a good case to be made for nationhood and nationalism and all of its positive aspects. I don't mean its negative aspects. There's plenty of negativism that has recharacterized the nationalist spirit as only an evil thing because of, frankly, Hitler and Nazi Germany. But nationhood is something that is tremendously unifying, and as one international relations scholar has put it, it's the most powerful force on earth. Nationalism is a force to be reckoned with that even the mightiest of countries struggle to retain in order to keep some semblance of an identity around which people are willing to aggregate their attention, their motivations, and be willing to fight and die for, that is lost the bigger civilization grows, the more languages and cultures and religions you acquire. I mean, there is an American set of holidays. There is an American language. It was English, and it still is. There is an American religious tradition. It's Christian. There are American symbols like the American flag. And you'll notice that in all of the revolutionary impulse and spirit that you and I were earlier talking about, all of those things, from the language to the national symbols to the holidays, are not just being added to, they're being replaced, and they're being subverted, and they're being rejected and criticized and demonized as if they're the product of, at this ultra-low resolution way of talking about things, just the product of white supremacy, just the product of the evil patriarchy or toxic masculinity. But that's nonsense, and it's not the true way to look at history. These things are the product of a nation, and that nation had a very common set of beliefs and basic assumptions about reality and language and religious system. And it was exceptionally tolerant compared to other countries on the earth of other traditions, other languages, other religious systems, but it had its own. And as long as it was able to keep that identity intact, the United States as a country thrived. And inasmuch as we've been willing to at first permit, and then to pretend to tolerate all of these other value systems as equal to our own, it was the very moment that our own national identity began to be abandoned and subverted. What's interesting about the moment we find ourselves in right now is that it was only now that we've gotten to the point of considering it possible that our national identity be extinguished that people have, on the one hand, become so willing to be emboldened to say things boldly. They tend to do it quite rudely. And there is a resurgence of nationalism. Some of it's healthy and some of it's not. And as important and essential a thing as nationalism is to the survival of any people, it has, as Solzhenitsyn would put it for the individual, that the dividing line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. So too in nations. If there's a nationalist spirit and it has a potential positive application and utility, it also has an equally dark application and utility. It can be a terribly destructive force, as we've seen in history. And that goes right back to the Kabbalion, as where people read about it mostly today, and the eternal hermetic principles that you mentioned earlier. There's a principle of correspondence. There's a principle of polarity. There's a principle of cause and effect. There are these ideas that are ever present but poorly understood that do really explain the context and the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And if you see the good, you're going to have a counterbalancing effect. You're going to have the counterbalancing influence of the not good, of the evil. And if you have a hero, you're going to have the villain. If you've got the impending doom and chaos, then you're going to have some forces that rise up seeking to establish the order. This is the way things go in the cosmos. It happens in biology, it happens in chemistry, it happens in civilizations, it happens in individuals' lives. And you either succumb to the forces of chaos, or or the hero prevails and establishes order. And the more you think about these things, the more related every bit of it is. It's really everywhere you look, whether it's history of civilizations, of humans, of planets, biology, the creatures, the ecology. It's all coming and going in cycles, and those hermetic principles are ever present.
Well said. And I think what you said about nationalism is so important, because whenever somebody talks about nationalism, it's so easy for one person in the crowd to stand up and say, "Oh, you're an ist," or "You're a phobe,"
right?
And that shuts down the whole conversation. But it's like you have to walk a very delicate line when you talk about it, but it has to be talked about. And if you just do away with it, like you said, multiculturalism doesn't work. You see certain countries right now that have just opened their doors and allowed like parallel societies to exist within their country. I'm hearing about it in like Scandinavia now. They have certain parallel societies where the people don't speak a single word of their language. They don't integrate into society. They don't pay taxes. Don't put in any effort to become part of that nation. And I'm thinking of like the opposite, where I'm half Japanese, and I just was in Japan this year, or in 2024. And I noticed some really interesting things. They have such a strong culture there, and they don't let in a lot of outsiders. They don't even bother learning English. Their fashion, their food, everything. The Japanese culture is very strong. And when I met a Brazilian guy that moved there, and he was so integrated into Japanese culture that I thought he was Japanese, but he was Brazilian. He spoke Japanese perfectly. He dressed Japanese. And I think with America, we're so tolerant that we've allowed, in many ways it's great, but we've allowed people to just kind of not integrate at all. And it doesn't seem to work. I don't know how better to put that.
I think you're right. In fact, my wife and I lived in Okinawa for a while I was flying F-15s, and we took unfortunately only one trip up to Tokyo. and I was amazed at the cleanliness and orderliness of society. And I don't even like a lot of the Japanese food, but I recognize the very thing you're talking about. I thought, man, like I can walk down the alleyway past all these trash cans that are so neatly bundled up under their nets at midnight and feel totally safe here in the city and feel like it's just, I mean, it was a really lovely thing, and it was uniquely, distinctly Japanese. And there's beauty in that, right? Just like there is, and if you go to a Middle Eastern country that has an authentic, pick your thing, Persian or something, Arabic, something that is like its own national identity, or a European country that has some nook still potentially left intact of its own national identity. I mean, an outsider or a typical modern American might look at Western Europe and say, "Oh, it's just all white people," which one isn't true anymore. But two, there's a reason there are these different, distinct European countries. Like they might kind of look the same to your average modern American, but these people, whether they're French or they're Spanish or they're Portuguese or they're Greek or they're, pick your thing. Like these people have their own country for a reason, their own spoken languages, their own, even if they share a common religious backdrop, they're very unique in so many important ways that make a nation a nation. And those nations, there's a reason we call them nation states. Those nations happen to have been formed into their own sovereign, intact territories that we call countries today. But it hasn't always been the case. And all of that is in jeopardy right now in America. And you really do have, this has been a melting pot in that we have every ethnicity, religion, belief system, value system, or lack thereof in place in this country, language, and they really can get along in their own sub-communities within this country, which has been so tolerant, and that's fine until it's not, and then you cease to have a nation, and then so.
And the irony is, since America is the most tolerant, they're the ones getting called the least tolerant constantly.
Right. Yeah.
Like you don't hear about, people aren't saying, "Oh, Saudi Arabia is so intolerant," but it's the ones that are so open and accepting that are the ones that are constantly getting berated.
Yeah. The Jewish state, for some, it's really an interesting thing. I mean, maybe it's just the view I'm developing because I'm on X a lot, and I'm in my own echo chamber, and I happen to see some of the same voices over and over. But it seems to me that especially in the past 12 months, the Jewish state has been increasingly scrutinized, and by Jewish state I'm talking about Israel, of course, by even conservatives in America, demonized, blamed for all of the world's problems. People are now talking about how we've overemphasized or lied about the Holocaust. And I watch all of this, and it's a really big curiosity to me how, I mean, a long time for the left, a long time in our history, the left has, I'd say, preferred the Palestinians and the Arab world to the Jewish world, which is a curiosity given the fact that, like, in Israel, in Tel Aviv is the only place you can go to a large gay pride gathering each year, which seems very much aligned with modern American leftist agenda and cultural preference. You can't do that anywhere else in the surrounding Arab countries. You can't go enjoy support for the LGBTQ agenda, but you can in Israel, and yet the leftists in America for a long time would rather support the surrounding Arab Muslim world in their conflicts against Israel and insist that Israel's the bad guys, even though culturally they seem somewhat aligned with the modern American and Western value system, emergent progressive value system. But now even conservatives are demonizing the Jewish state, Israel. There's a lot of, there's historical precedent for some of the views that are being shared, but certainly not all of the views. And there's a lot of conspiracy theorizing and false allegations, and they pick up steam really quickly on social media these days, it's a really interesting, curious time to be alive and to watch all of this. I'm really interested to see how this is going to play out. The Bible makes it clear that at some point all nations will be gathered against Israel. That doesn't seem like under the Trump Vance administration we've yet reached that period in which all nations will be gathered against Israel. And whatever that really means, it at least means that yet again, I think the Arab Muslim countries will be rallied against Israel. They currently are, in essence, but it's not gone to full-blown conflagration just yet. But I'll be really interested to see at what point, if ever, the United States decides to withdraw its total political support from Israel as it tries to defend itself against the constant onslaught from its surrounding countries. In fact, I mean, there are millions of Arab Muslims that live inside Israel. I've been to Israel a couple of times. You walk down the street, you see the black-clad women who are clearly Muslim walking the streets up and down past the Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem. And usually, not always, but usually it's not the Jewish people that are going around attacking the Arab Muslims that happen to live there among them in peace. And yet all of the surrounding Arab Muslim world is adamant that at some point Israel cease to exist. I'm not saying that generally of the population, but there's a different value system, a different religious system, a different culture and worldview in the surrounding Arab world, and they're getting more and more support, even from many in the West, unfortunately, which is why you see, I mean, there's nationalist, conservative, or traditional leaders being elected to many countries in Western, to the chief seats in Western countries right now. Think of Millet down south, and you've got other leaders in Europe, and now here at home in America, we've got an aggressive response to what seems like madness to many people.
So your book came out in 2021, and I'm curious to get your opinion on what has changed since this book came out. Like, has the pendulum now swung into the opposite? Are you concerned about it going too far the other direction?
No, I'm not concerned about it going too far the other direction. What has changed since I've written my book? The book became a national bestseller. In fact, at the time when Dr. Seuss was being canceled on Amazon, at the time Dr. Seuss was being canceled, his books were selling at the top of the charts on Amazon among all book categories, and mine was just above Dr. Seuss's Oh, the Places You'll Go. Mine was the number one seller of all categories on Amazon, and then Oh, the Places You'll Go was number two. That was short-lived, of course, but after the book sold so well, I had many people around the country inviting me to speak at conferences, mostly political in nature, and I have done that for a couple of years, and some independent film producers in Nashville, Tennessee reached out saying they'd like to make a movie about this book and about cultural Marxism, about the divisive threat of critical race theory and DEI trainings in military culture. And I agreed to do that with them. And so for the past year and a half, I've made a film, and that's got an imminent release right now. You'll hear more about that in the days ahead. And that has happened. It's generated an awful lot of discussion in the halls of our nation's capital and Congress, in both the Senate and the House. I went to testify before the House Oversight Committee in January of 2024, and both sides of the political aisle have taken up an argument, essentially, about what I have referred to as cultural Marxist talking points in the military. All of that has transpired in the past several years since writing the book. I had perhaps naively hoped that writing a book and talking about it was going to help solve our problem. And in fact, it's certainly generated a greater awareness of the problems we're facing, but it hasn't solved any problems because people are reluctant to altogether abandon their paradigm and adopt an entirely different one. And so instead what you see is a greater number of people becoming aware of the problem of cultural Marxism and of its divisive nature on the one hand, And on the other hand, you've got people recognizing that there's now some pushback, and so they're digging in their heels and crafting new ways in which to continue their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, even if it means renaming those offices or programs or job positions so that they can continue through the next administration and wait things out. We're doing that in the Defense Department. In fact, I have troops reaching out to me and saying, hey, FYI, this DEI office just renamed itself. Here's the new office name. And if you weren't aware of it, it would likely continue to exist for the next 4 years and receive taxpayer dollars to have jobs that simply push ideology and divisive ideology. I think we've seen a national response, and a majority of the country has responded to cultural Marxism, to what is colloquially referred to as wokeism, which seems like sheer madness to most sane people, because it is. And people have shown up and voted for change, which is why I think we saw what seemed a year ago an unlikely re-election of now President Trump and J.D. Vance to the presidency. We've got a demand from the American people for change, and I think that demand signal is present in other Western European countries. But at the same time as the pendulum has swung a bit in the opposite direction from the insanity to a regard for and remembrance of tradition and our shared historical makeup, you've got what I will call a withdrawal of good feelings towards our fellow citizens. If you're not aligned in your values or your worldview, or you happen to find yourselves in different political parties, I think we have every bit as much animus now as at any time in American history. It's not gone away. And as excited as some Americans are about the recent presidential election outcome, we haven't abandoned our meanness for one another. And I think we're going to enter the next administration here in just a couple of weeks with hope for some aggressive changes to be made in the future, which is warranted. But unless we can abandon our animus for one another, and that, of course, that goes both ways. It's nearly impossible for one side to abandon its hatred or animosity for the other if the other is constantly warring against it. And so it seems incredibly unlikely. It's simply not in the nature of political parties to do that, and that's where the heart of our division lies at the moment. But we're going to have both opportunities for change in this next administration, and also the continuation of infighting in particular. And that makes us exceptionally vulnerable on the world stage. And the last chapter of my book, which was the driving impetus behind writing the book, is called Averting the Wrath to Come, which is the unavoidable result or outcome of the Marxist revolutionary impulse that every nation faces once this impulse really takes hold, and it's genocidal and fratricidal violence. Government will fight its people will fight one another, and if we continue down this path of terrible division, call it whatever we might want to call it, and I know it's rooted in Marxism, you end up seeing people become violent to solve their problems. And it's one of the reasons why retaining free speech is so important. It's because that needs to be the road or the mechanism, the path that people have available to them for the expression of their grievances. You want people to speak freely, or even to shout at one another occasionally and vent and let off steam towards one another and say, I really hate you for the following reasons. And even if they can't articulate that, just to say, I hate you. And we can wag our finger all day and say, well, that's hate speech. And I'd say that's better than violence. And the hate speech can certainly lead to the latter, but to take away people's platform for speech, to violate or to censor their First Amendment right to speech and to peaceably assemble, that is a sure recipe for violence and revolution. And it's a good thing we've relatively kept it intact. But we'll see what the next administration chooses to do. I have hope that we can have positive change and a reprieve for a season, but we're certainly not out of trouble. All the trouble still looms. We just have a different administration coming in. And it's my sense that very difficult things are ahead. I wish it weren't so, but I have to say it as I see it and feel it. And so that's in a nutshell what's happened since I wrote my book. The last chapter, if people haven't read the book, I'd say, well, go read the last chapter. It'll warn you about what's coming. If you're interested in seeing what I wrote before that, then feel free. I think it's a good book. It's not a waste of someone's time if they're interested in the topic, although I spend most of my time reading things other than politics and cultural Marxism, and but we have to get more grounded in reality. We have to be more grounded in spending our time focused on that which is lovely and good and true, and not as caught up in the passionate, partisan, and polarized arguing that we're involved in, because it really does darken society, regardless of who's in power.
Well said. Well said. And your book is excellent. I've learned a ton from it. Got a great history lesson. And I'm hopeful for the future, cautiously optimistic right now, but I feel like a lot of the strong-minded, free-thinking people have found their voice in many ways. And a lot of those people that were guilt and shaming people into conformity or submission, they're kind of getting exposed now. So I'm, their old tactics are not working anymore. I think there was there was a call to do a revolutionary rally after Trump won and nobody showed up. So it's like the energy of that, it kind of peaked in 2020, I felt like. But like you said, the danger is always there. There's always going to be people that have that resentment building up and play the victim and want to point a finger. So that's never going to go away. And, but I'm super grateful for your courage and your work and taking the time. And, where can people find you?
MatthewLohmeier.com is my website. I'm fairly confident my Twitter on handle is Matthew Lohmeier. Let me say that again. I'm fairly confident my handle on X is Matthew Lohmeier. The organization I work for is called STARS, STARRS.US. And that organization is focused, it's an education-based nonprofit, and it's focused on educating people about the dangers of cultural Marxism and cultural Marxism's influence on our military. And they should be on the lookout for my coming movie. It's called Against All Enemies. It's been independently produced by Nashville-based film producers. The director for my film was the lead editor on Matt Walsh's Am I Racist and What is a Woman? And
I saw that.
It's a very different kind of a film. It's serious. It's a bit sobering. It talks both about cultural Marxism and the domestic threat that we face of division, but it also talks about China, it talks about space, and it talks about the need to repent and turn back to God and find our grounding in the spiritual path once again if we're to be recovered as a nation. And I think that the viewer will sense all of that even though it's not overt in the film, and we'll have a bit of I think it'll be a good experience, a good viewing experience for people.
Awesome. I can't wait for that.